All right, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. It is 11 o'clock by my watch in Chicago, so it's time to begin. Thank you for attending this PowerCast, Strengthen Your IBM Security Against Ransomware by Sandi Moore of Help Systems. This PowerCast is sponsored by Help Systems. My name is Ian Cartwright. I'm Education Manager for Common, and if you experience any technical issues during the presentation, go ahead and send me a chat message through chat. If you'd like to send a written question to Sandi about the content during the presentation, use the Q&A area. Sandi will answer your questions at the end of the presentation as time permits. Presenting today is Sandi Moore. Sandi's been working with Help Systems customers for over 15 years, supporting systems monitoring and security software. Experience in IBM I, AIX, and Linux. She's been involved in product demonstrations, implementation, support, training, research, and product testing. And she shared her knowledge at multiple user group conferences, including many of these PowerCasts at Common over the past year or two. With that, I'm going to hand control over to Sandi. Sandi, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Ian. All right. So yes, I'm excited to share some information with you guys, and I think it's extremely relevant, and I don't think anybody would deny that they've ever heard of ransomware. So today I want to talk about strengthening your IBM security against ransomware. Really, what we're looking for is for you to actually take action before you get hit by ransomware. Unfortunately, I talked to a lot of people that are being reactive, and I like the proactive approach. As Ian said, I'm Sandi Moore, been with Help Systems for quite some time. I really enjoy security. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and really hope that I'll be able to share some good information with you guys today. Help Systems' goal is to help build a better IT, creating simpler, smarter, and more powerful IT. So really the goal here is to get those software solutions in place to help you with your security initiatives. Today we're focused on IBM I, but Help Systems has been very proactive in finding security solutions across all platforms. Unix, Linux, and Windows has been a big push to make sure that we're providing customers with the whole solution across their entire environment. Our security investment has been huge, and we have our premier security products recognized as Powertech, and we have comprehensive IBM I, AIX security services, member of PCI Security Standards Council, published the annual State of IBM I Security Study, as well as participated in the CIS IBM I benchmark contributor. If you guys didn't realize that there were CIS benchmarks now for IBM I, you need to go look at that. So it's a good baseline for you. All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about the threats, because you can't not talk about the threats before you talk about what you need to do about them. How ransomware is going to impact your IBM I and what is impacted, and then also how you're going to protect the system itself. Of course, you have to start with ransomware itself. By definition, it's malware that's planted illegally on a computer or mobile device, disables operation and access to the data until the owner or operator pays to regain control or access. Pretty straightforward. Hold your stuff for ransom. It's unfortunate this has become a defined noun, and it is prevalent. Actually, I'm seeing 81% of malware at this point is tied to ransomware in some form or another. Ransomware is not is straightforward. There's actually multiple types of ransomware, and this is something where we have our focus. We think there's one type, and then that's it, and that's what we look for. But there's a variety. There's encrypting and cryptoware, which actually encrypts the file, makes them inaccessible. And I think that's the one that we're most familiar with. But there's also mobile device ransomware, where it infects a cell phone through drive-by downloads or fake apps. If you're connecting your phone to an open Wi-Fi network, you're vulnerable that way as well. MBR NTFS ransomware, where it's actually preventing you from booting it up into a live OS environment. So the whole computer itself is held for ransom as opposed to the files. Leakware and extortionware. This actually is becoming more prevalent, and this is where the data is exfiltrated first, and the attackers threaten to release that information if the ransom's not paid. As people have moved away from just paying the ransom because they've got some backups that they can restore from, they say, oh, we'll just restore, we don't care. really that's where the extortionware has picked up, because it's really about trying to get people to pay. And so they're going after information that you really probably don't want to have exposed. And there's also non-encrypting lock screen ransomware, where it restricts access to your file and data, but it's not actually encrypting them. So you get the pop-up screen that says you must pay your ransom, and then once you do, you have access to the files, but they're not actually encrypted. So a variety of things that are happening. And as I mentioned, 81% of organizations infected by encrypting ransomware or cryptoware. So really the prevalence is for malware at this point is typically going to be that ransomware. And so what we're seeing with that is that there needs to be a new strategy. Even though, you know, those organizations that are getting hit, they have a strategy in place for preventing ransomware, yet they're still getting hit. So really, it's not about just having a simple solution or a single solution to preventing this from happening. There needs to be some more thoughts on how to mitigate this. There's a lot of ransomware strains out there, and there's actually probably, since I put this slide together, there's probably been some more, but Hive, Conti, Lockbit 2.0, those are really the most current from we've seen in the ransomware strains, but it does come up more often that there's even more. So they're always going to be there. They're going to have new names. There's new organizations behind it. You get the ransomware as a service, and they're going to name their own ransomware, but it's all backed by some of these well-known ransomware strains. It's come to the point where there have been warnings from FBI, CISA, as well as NSA about state-sponsored cyber operations attacking. And the infrastructure itself is really what we're concerned about most. But really, these ransomware attacks have continued to be targeting specific types of industries. And now we're seeing that they're actually attacking specific critical times for organizations. So agriculture, for example, being attacked right at picking time. So retail attacked during the busiest high season, Black Friday, or all the way through the holiday season. So really going after organizations at their most vulnerable time, where they actually can't afford to be hit because the business is at its most important point of the year. So 14 out of 16 specific critical infrastructures were hit last year. So really, this is it is targeted. They're being smart about it, and we have to take it very seriously. I think people are taking it seriously. The IBMI Marketplace survey, Tom Huntington, you may know him. He does this every year, and in his survey, he's still finding that the cybersecurity ransomware is still the top concern. So 4 years in a row, cybersecurity's been at the top. We actually added ransomware to that this year, and it climbed even higher in the initiatives. So it's good that it's a concern. What we need to do, though, is start defining where the security initiatives are taking place and making sure that they're focused in the right areas. Our State of IBMI security study, done by Robin Tatum, my colleague, and I, this is actually taking data from customer systems. And in our security study, we're finding that virus protection has actually been increased. So over 2021 to this year, there was actually a 5% increase in virus protection on the systems. So not only are we seeing it in opinion surveys, but we're also seeing it in actual data surveys that, in fact, this is being taken seriously, and it's not just the whole network that's being protected, but we're also moving into IBMI and increasing that exposure. So when we're talking about IBMI specifically and the data that these threat actors are after, you have to consider what's on your system. So whether you have PCI data, credit card numbers on your system, I see that much less than I used to. And really the we're seeing more tokens. So PCI information is not necessarily going to be hosted on those servers, which is good, but we are seeing PII data. So you've got EPHI data, bank account numbers, user IDs and passwords. I actually found somebody who was storing user IDs and passwords in an unencrypted file on their system. It was horrifying. PIN numbers, payroll information, could be tax ID numbers, driver's license numbers, any financial data for the company, trade secrets. So if you've got product formulas or the size of the widget that you put into your special machine, that is going to make it work better than everybody else's. Who your customers are. There's competition in business. So, you know, your customers are your gold. Or if you're a transportation company, your truck driver's information, your employee information is gold. You know, it's hard to find employees right now. And so you certainly don't want somebody cherry picking that information. Or who your suppliers are. You don't want to know people to know who you're getting your stuff from, because they're going to go to them too. And now your prices are going to be undercut. Essentially, these threat actors are after anything that's confidential to your organization, its employees or its customers. So it's really about finding information that you care about that they're going to hold for ransom. Very often, the IBMI is that core server that has this specific information on it. You've got other servers in that are on the perimeter of that, but really this is where the meat of the information is. So, you know, consider what you have on your system, and if somebody were to threaten it, would you be concerned? When we talk about motivation behind these attacks, there's a variety of reasons why they happen. And, you know, I've read some interesting articles on it. Reputation on the dark web is a big one, where they can brag to others that they've been able to get into this particular environment and what they've been able to get to, and that they were the ones behind this massive attack that made the news globally. And so, you know, that reputation is a big thing for them to prove that, hey, I'm the best at this. Even though it's something bad, they want to be the best. A resentment. So there are actually, I read an entire expose from a guy who said that his targets are because he resents the fact that they don't take security seriously. And he's looking for actually teaching them a lesson, because he's mad that they didn't try to keep him out. So I think it's crazy, but those are some of those reasons behind that. Challenge to find new vulnerabilities. So the challenge of looking for that. You know, if we could take those minds that are doing that and actually put them to good use, that would be fantastic. So getting them on those pen testing teams would be fabulous. Gateway to more targets. So you get into one and you've got access to another. So think Solaris, or not Solaris, SolarWinds, you know, there's your gateway to more targets. And then of course, money. Who doesn't need money? We have to pay for our lifestyles. So, and that's really where we start seeing that the organized crime comes in. And so to support their organized crime or their organization, they need money. So they've got some pretty significant groups that are actually behind those attacks, and they are making billions of dollars. And that's billions, not millions. All right, so quick poll there, Ian. I think we need to throw that out there. I'm actually curious to find out how you're currently protecting your IBMI from ransomware. So you only have a single choice here. So we'll go with either yes, you have full protection. You have protection from ransomware, but nothing specific for IBMI, or maybe you're not sure. Depends on who you're involved with. And so that you may or may not actually know what those layers are. But if you are responsible for the IBMI, I think you should get yourself familiar with what exactly is available out there.
Last chance to put in your selections here. All right, here are the results.
All right. Looks like, well, we have a pretty good spread here, Ian. Let's see. Currently protecting IBMI, we have full protection. So 25% of you, that's actually pretty good. That's better than my percentage on my IBMI security studies. Nothing specific for IBMI, but they have something in place, so that's good. 30% there, and actually almost half of you are not sure what's protecting your IBMI from ransomware. So that's definitely something to start asking some questions. And I think this is a good time to start looking at that. All right, let's carry on. External threats becoming internal threats. So really there's a three-pronged attack that we're seeing a significant increase in. Phishing, third most common type of scam reported to FBI. So really this is how they're getting into your environments. There's emails that are sent into your employees. They appear to be from someone that you know, or they're looking for you to think it's the bank emailing you, and it's really a fake email address or a fake web address in there that points you to a malicious website. You put in your credentials, and it really wasn't the bank. They've actually now got your information. There's a lot of different ways that they're able to do this, and Office 365 is vulnerable. You know, so many of us are remote now that we're relying on all of these online services, and I think our attention goes down. So really, that's a huge way this is coming in. Malware gets downloaded in individual PCs. So, and this is where it can start with that individual PC. They have access to the network. They have access to the critical servers in the environment, and it starts there. And then those credentials, once they've been compromised, can be used later on for further attacks. So logging into servers, application, third-party websites. So really the way they're getting to your information is extremely sneaky. And sometimes it's not even, you don't even realize it's happened. Or it happened long enough ago before the attack actually begins that you don't connect the dots, that this phishing attempt here is related to this 2 months later ransomware attack. You know, these persistence attacks that lead to the ransomware always start with that initial infection. Once that initial infection happens, there's a secondary infection that gets out into the environment, so out to each of the servers. Once they've got that secondary infection propagated, that data is being exfiltrated off the system. Then they're pushing out their ransomware code. So once that's pushed out, ransomware happens, that's game on. So now all of these servers are compromised. What's going to be compromised and the impact here, it can be an entire server encrypted by ransomware. So this is actually a screenshot from someone who contacted me and said, hey, we got hit by ransomware. We didn't even know it. And they had an entire development system that the entire IFS root directory is shared there. That actually ended up being encrypted by ransomware, their whole entire development system. It actually took them a number of days, actually probably weeks, before they even discovered it. Nobody had been paying attention to the development system. They weren't really worried about it. But think about what you put on your development system. It's probably the same thing that's on your production system. It just might be some stale data. So it actually is a big deal. Those attacks can have a variety of outcomes. So, you know, in the middle of the screen there, 248,000 viruses on a system. That's probably one of the worst infections I've seen. And really, it's about what is on the system, how did it get there, and how are you going to clean it up? The attacks can gain access to anything that you have in your integrated file system. So whether it's QIBM, if it's your web server, company with a web server that had a Trojan horse program loaded on it, and they had no idea, and it had been there for 9 years. So the way these attacks happen and the way they're able to sit on these servers for long periods of time can be extremely problematic, even with current protections in place on the network. And it continues. You know, we have, you know, people ask me, just yesterday, Do you guys have anything that's happened recently? Well, absolutely. Some of these infections are old, but the fact that they're sitting on a server and these attacks have been sitting there able to be on the system for someone to be able to access. You may not have a problem if your PC is up to date, but I guarantee that there's some PC in your environment that has less than ideal protections on it. It might be the PC in the warehouse in the back corner that prints the labels for the packages, or it could be from the mailroom. Everybody shares it and nobody's paying attention to whether or not it's been updated. That's the one that's going to access the viruses and then cause an outbreak again, because that's a vulnerable PC. So, IBMI has always been touted to be immune to the virus threat, but it can be impacted by that ransomware and malware in your network. As you saw from those print screens, from those images, that it does happen. And the way that virus activity can be not only discovered and propagated is through map drives. So if you have shares over your IFS, you've created a potential for not only viruses spreading to the IBMI, but also spreading off of IBMI. FTP, really easy way to move things, regardless of the object type, up and down from the system. Image catalogs, backup tapes, high availability, all of these can actually propagate files to and from the IFS. So really making it vulnerable to happily accepting this malware, and you never even notice it. IBMI doesn't have it built in to actually be able to recognize that it's a threat to the system. So when antivirus is deployed everywhere else, these viruses can still reach your power system servers. So as I mentioned, we rely on all of these layers of protection. If all of those layers were working all the time, the attacks would have stopped already. So there are vulnerabilities. There are places where things can be disabled, whether it's by the ransomware itself or it's by the user. The vulnerable PC, it doesn't take all of your workstations to be vulnerable. It only takes one. And those infections can still occur with those zero-day exploits. So something that's brand new, that's never actually been identified before. And you get a zero-day exploit, your PC software doesn't recognize it, and it gets populated to the IBMI. What's going to catch it? It's going to sit there waiting for somebody else. Failed virus definition updates, deactivated or blocked virus engine. So all of those things can actually make the system vulnerable. That's why you have to have those layers in place. So one layer is not going to prevent it. You have to have every possible point at which you can protect the assets of the company protected. Of course, we talk about IBMI can't get viruses. So those native objects are immune against viral infection, but the IFS, or the integrated file system, is not. So you really need to make sure that you are protecting the IFS specifically. You can't use the same strategies as you do for your native objects. Those native objects aren't necessarily going to be infected or encrypted by that malware, but they can be renamed or deleted by threat actors or code that's running and deleting. So if your users have, whatever your users have the ability to do to the system, that threat actor that's using their credentials or their connection to the system is going to have that same authority. Think about all object users. You've got all object users on the system and they have access to a file share and they are compromised. What's going to happen? So those other IFS structures can also be renamed, deleted, encrypted, and infected. So it's not actually a non-issue. This is a critical portion of your system. So the way that this is going to spread, map drives, that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities that I see. The ability for you to connect from your PC to the IFS and have that direct connection, it's just another drive on the system. Now, whether they use that map drive or not, or they're using a net use command in a command prompt, it is very easy to copy files up to the system. You can see there in my example, I'm copying a virus from my desktop in my documents up to my home directory on the IFS. So it's extremely easy and it needs to be stopped. Viruses can also spread to the system through FTP. So talked about FTP. It's a very easy to way moving large numbers of objects up and down from the system. So if you are in fact able to access the system through FTP, it's a very simple process. So this may not spread it to your PC if you're pulling a file down until you actually launch it, but you've got that easy way for files to get up to the server and you have no idea what went up there. And you don't need any special applications or special programs to get those files up there. Again, DOS command window. Hopefully you have this disabled and your users are not able to. But if they have user ID and password for the IBMI, they have access to that, you have no idea what's going up to the system. So it is very easy to spread that to the system that way. Install media is another. I have actually seen infected files in coming from a vendor. And so their IFS directory had an infected file in it that they shipped with their update. So everyone assumes everybody else is doing their part to make sure that there's no malware involved in their files, but nobody's actually checking. So it does happen. Business partners that can access your system. You've got NSF mounts. Anywhere you have made a direct connection between the IBMI and a Windows server, AIX server, Linux server, that right there creates that connection, and those files can be moved back and forth easily, and viruses are now on the system. Now, I want to mention here, I talk about viruses and malware and ransomware. Ransomware is just another form of malware. So it is I use malware and virus interchangeably. It's essentially something that gets into your network and does damage. So, it's there semantics there if you want to get into that. I personally really feel that it's just another form of a virus. Where it lives is important, and that's really what we're focused on. So encrypting files on IBMI, this is actually a great example. I ran this myself. So one of my colleagues put together a little emulator for ransomware, and it's built to encrypt my entire iDrive, which is mapped to a directory in my IFS. So very easy for you to have files. If I'm allowed to rename and change a file, I can encrypt it. So it doesn't take much for this to happen. And now you've got a file that is no longer legible, it's no longer usable, it has been encrypted. So whatever they're having access to, what's in your IFS, taking that inventory and knowing what's on the system. Because if this has been exfiltrated first, you've got to know what actually left the system and how concerned do you need to be. Now, those file shares, those are really the root of the problem. And I say that tongue in cheek. The root directory is absolutely the worst thing you can share. I showed in my example here of what not to do. This is do as I say, not as I do. Do not share the root directory. Those shares that are discoverable and are read-write are vulnerable. This is where the system is going to be a target. It's another drive. Whether or not those users know how to map that drive or not, the fact that that share exists and it's discoverable, it's vulnerable. These threat actors are not coming in and just attacking today, they're getting into your environment. They're looking around and they're exploring. You have no idea, potentially even months before that ransomware attack actually triggers. So they've found all of your juicy spots in the network. They've found where everybody is connecting. They're exploring those shares that are discoverable to see what's there. And when they find those, that's when that's what's going to come under attack. So I can't emphasize enough to not share the root directory. You're going to hear me say this again. Don't share the root directory. I actually worked with a company who said, no, we don't share root. And there were a number of people on the call, and one of the gentlemen on the call, he kind of cleared his throat and everybody stopped and said, what? And he said, we do share root. And they said, what? No, we don't. He said, actually, we have it shared twice. So they didn't call it root on the second share, they called it something else. So everybody assumed that this share was to something specific. And this is how those ransomware attacks are going to clobber your system, is through these shares. So what's at risk when you have these shares? What's on the IFS that we care about? Well, if you look under the root directory, qsys.lib, which is your operating system, is part of that. So if you have an attack where they are actually going through and attempting to encrypt all of your files on that root share, they may not be able to encrypt that qsys.lib, those objects, those programs, those commands, those database files. But if that user has authority to delete them, that ransomware is piggybacked on top of, you can have objects deleted out of qsys.lib during a ransomware attack. So it is critical that you address those shares, because the operating system itself can be clobbered. There was actually a gentleman who recently did launch a simulated ransomware attack on an IBM to the root directory. It took a while, but eventually it completely clobbered and deleted the entire system. So, there comes a point where it just completely falls over and that attack can't continue because so much has been damaged. But it is possible. It can happen, and it has happened. So not only the operating system itself, but how you connect to the system is also at risk. So if you look at your qsys.lib directory, if you've shared that root, that qsys.lib is available. The way you connect to the system is in fact vulnerable. So, when I was looking at this the other day, I realized the host file, I had actually just updated my host table entries, and that QATOC host file, that had a current date on it. So this is vulnerable. And actually, going back to one of those original screenshots I shared with you on a ransomware attack, the customer that had 248,000 copies of ransomware on their system with 500,000 files encrypted by the ransomware, they discovered and figured out that they were under attack because they could no longer connect to their IBM remotely. So they went into the office, it was on the weekend, and they went into the office and they couldn't connect from their workstation either. They had to go to the console. One of the things that was discovered was their TCP/IP configuration files had been damaged during that ransomware attack that was continuing. So if your systems all of a sudden become an island, you're not going to be able to conduct business. So there's always talk about high availability. Yeah, we're replicating, we're good, we can recover. Yeah, unfortunately, if an object's deleted by a virus or ransomware or a hacker, it's also going to be deleted on your HA system. It's really good at replicating problems like this. So object gets renamed on your target, on your production system, that target system that's also going to be renamed. If it's encrypted by the ransomware, it's going to be replicated onto the HA system, encrypted. So those HA systems are unfortunately not going to save you from those ransomware attacks. You've really got to start considering a new or separate recovery plan for ransomware attacks, making sure that if this happens, where am I going to find my system information to be able to recover from this? And you don't want to pay the ransom. This is something that they're stressing. The more that's paid, the more they're going to attack. There's money in it. They're going to go after you. So not paying and being willing to go ahead and do your restore, you have to have the right things available in order to do that. All right, so I like to talk about layers of protection. So I think even for IBM, there really have to be layers of protection. There's not a one size fits all. If somebody tells you that, hey, this will solve all of your problems, that's not true. I think they're misleading you. They're doing, it has to be layers. And With the IBMI, there's a combination, and this hybrid approach is going to be using server configuration. So actually configuring the server correctly to start with, and then software to help you with that. So really that hybrid approach is where it's at. And it's again, adding to the layers. One layer is not enough. It has to be multiple places that you've added these protections in place, and really focusing on the server itself, because it's the last place that you're adding these layers. So for cleanup and operating system controls, IBM gave you some good stuff to work with. So if you've got this set correctly from the get-go, you've reduced your exposure. I say it again, eliminate those read-write shares to root directory. If you're not sure who's using that root share, that's a real reason to remove it, because you will hear very quickly from those users that can no longer get to it. At that point, you work with the user to figure out, what are you getting to? What do you need access to? And then create a separate share. Don't share it with the public. Give that user explicit authority to that share instead of leaving it wide open. Wherever you can create a read-only share, then with a read-only share, the only thing that's going to happen, and I'm saying that facetiously, the only thing that's going to happen is that your data will be exfiltrated. It's not going to be damaged. So there's still issues with shares there, but we have to make the system available and we have to be able to use the system. So this is about finding that balance of shares that are appropriate for the right users only. Controlling the public authority on the root. So the data authority RX, object authority none, is going to lock down that root share, which is by default shipped basically wide open, and making sure that you don't have that vulnerability. So if you have the unfortunate root share, then at least you're going to have it modified so that it's not going to be fully able to be deleted. Now I'm going to remind you that with the public authorities, that your all object authorities don't apply. Those users are the exception, and they will still have the ability to delete anything from a root share, even with that public authority locked down. Set your public authority on your directories with the confidential information to data authority exclude, object authority none, and then authorize those specific profiles that have a business need. So, IBMI does not by default follow a zero trust policy. So, we're working backwards in trying to reduce what's available to users. And I think it's critical that this is addressed. Reduce your number of users with all object special authority. So this it should be a no-brainer, but we continue to see more and more companies with users with all object, whether they have all object of special authority directly or it's obtained through a group profile. I actually came across a third-party application recently. It was an ERP software. The group profile by default had all object. So everybody that connected to the system with that group profile, which was everybody, now had all object. So you have to address that, because however the user is able to get to the system, that all object authority is exposing everything to being deleted, renamed, modified, all of the above. You can hide your shares. So I talked about discoverable shares. So by adding a $sign to the end of that share name, it hides it. So it will not be discoverable. So at least while it's available still to specific users who know about that share, it's not going to be available to anybody on the network. Now, we do have to still grant users access. So there are still going to be points of compromise, but it's again finding a balance of allowing those shares to exist, but putting enough layers in place that we've minimized the potential for damage. And then, qsys.lib talked about the operating system being available through the root directory. So you can actually restrict access to the qsys.lib file system if somebody's accessing it through Windows Explorer, through that map drive or Navigator for I, by excluding users from that QPWF server authorization list. So be careful with that. You want to do public exclude on the authorization list, not on qsys.lib. I had somebody do that, and she said, nobody can get to the system. I'm like, yeah, you basically excluded the entire company from qsys.lib, the OS. So it's the authorization list, and this authorization list is weird. It actually doesn't show that it's securing any objects, and that is correct. It's actually kind of a sideshow from IBM, where they said, oh, we have to be able to restrict qsys.lib through the file server. We'll use this authorization list, and we'll look at the authorization list, see who's authorized to access it. It's odd, but it works. You know, when you're doing that cleanup and considering those operating system controls, you know, consider getting some assistance with that. Our Help System Security Services team does security remediation services, so they can actually help you work through this. Because obviously, making these types of drastic changes, you have to be careful with that. You don't want to lock the system down, and you don't want to, you know, suddenly, as I mentioned, deny access to the entire company, to the operating system. So you have to be careful with that, and having somebody knowledgeable to assist you with that can be invaluable. Native virus scanning. So mitigating that malware on IBMI. I've given you plenty of examples of how malware can get to the IBMI, how it can attack and damage the IBMI. So having native virus scanning in place is critical. So using that virus scanning, making sure that you're automatically scanning the files that are being accessed through the file server. So those map drives, those net views. So when those files are being opened, making sure that if their malware did get onto the system through any avenue, that before that end user opens that file, you've scanned it. Make sure that it's not spreading. It's not acting as the host of an infection in the network. Make sure that you're actually scanning all of your files in the IFS. So not only those ones the users are mapping drives and opening through that share, but making sure that some way, I don't know, one of those other back ways into the system, that somebody hasn't actually populated malware onto the system. Make sure that you're reviewing and deleting infected files that have been found through that process from the quarantine directory. IBM actually has controls on the operating system that support the virus scanning. One of those is attributes on your stream files that tracks the scan status. When that file is scanned and found to be infected, it's going to be marked as a failure, and it'll be in that quarantine directory. IBM recognizes that when you do an option 21 save, it's actually going to check to see your scan status. They don't want you to save infected files, so it will actually fail on that save. And so you want to make sure that you're not leaving those known infected files on your system. You need to monitor user activity through NetServer, so that file server access. So whether it's through ACS integrated file system access, or it's the mapped drives, or it's the net use, that you're actually watching that user activity and blocking anything suspicious. So if somebody is doing a read, rename, encrypt, and delete of a file, that's suspicious. So make sure you're actually watching for that activity and blocking it when it starts happening. Make sure that you're keeping your virus definitions up to date. If you do have audit requirements, anything that's government regulatory requirements or SOX requirements, that native virus scanning is actually going to be required. There's actually a whole host of mandates that include a clause that says you need to have virus protections on any place, any known server that is known to be a threat or threatened. And so I think that I've provided enough information that shows that the IBMI is actually under threat from malware. You want to make sure you're using a commercially backed antivirus solution. So really having a solid reputation behind your malware protection is critical. So the Powertech Antivirus for IBMI with anti-ransomware technology from Help Systems provides that for you. You can actually meet each of these agenda items with the Powertech Antivirus. So including that anti-ransomware, being able to actually monitor that suspicious activity, block the user when they start the attack so that it does not continue. Of course, people say, why can't I just use my Windows antivirus and scan the IFS that way? So when you're using a non-native solution, you actually are going to undo a lot of those recommendations that I just made. So you're going to have to do a read, write, share over the root in order to actually scan the IFS. So undoing that recommendation, you're going to have a network connection from that PC or Windows server to the IBMI share, and you're going to have to use an all object profile to run that scan. So now you've actually added the additional exposure of an all object profile with access to that root share. It's not real time. So you're going to have to kick it off from that Windows workstation, and it's going to run and chug away, and it's not going to update the attributes on the stream files on the system. It's not going to know to move it to a quarantine directory so you can review where it came from, who did it, and know how long it's been on the system. It doesn't know if it's supposed to scan every object in the IFS every time. So IBM allows you to control that. So maybe you are intended to only scan files that have changed since the last time you scanned. That workstation antivirus isn't going to know how to do that. You're going to have to actively monitor that PC scanning to see if there's any problems. You're going to take everything from your IFS. And I guarantee, even if you think you're not using your IFS, you have a lot in your IFS. And it's going to actually take that, move it across the network in clear text over to that PC to do that scanning. So you've actually are taking everything in your IFS and intentionally exposing it. So it really does have a whole host of pitfalls to this PC scanning, and I really don't recommend attempting it. That native scanning is critical. No operating systems are immune. The malware is going after every operating system. I've actually been seeing more updates on the Mac OS. So, this is where they're getting their money. This is where these attacks are going to come from. Any system can act as a host. So whether or not they show symptoms of these attacks, they are very happy to host those out. And those non-native scanning programs are going to be moving that data across, needlessly exposing information. So really having everything done natively in place, it's each of those layers, making sure that everywhere you are protecting it as you should. Now, when we're talking about our Powertech antivirus for IBMI, we've always been able to scan for ransomware that's stored on IBMI. So anything where the system's acting as a host, we've actually added some enhancements to it so that we're able to protect ransomware that's attacking the IBMI, because a lot of that ransomware is no longer dropping copies of itself. They're not self-replicating because they don't want to be discovered quickly, so they can actually attack more. So being able to watch for those attacks and be able to block them is critical. And so that functionality has really gone from being able to just see what's happening on the system, but we're also able to detect it from outside sources. So being able to mitigate and block those users from those attacks is critical function. So with the ransomware protection on IBMI, you can easily configure, overrides, and you can even set a canary file so that if you have a file that has no business need for anybody to actually open or tamper with, they can be blocked that way as well. So really taking it full circle so that we're looking at the malware on the system, but the malware attacking the system, and making sure that we're protecting it from all angles. Exit points are another. controlling access to the system through all of those backdoors to the system. I mentioned map drives and FTP. Ways that you can get IFS files to the system are ways that malware can get to the system. So using exit programs to restrict who can actually access the system at all through each of those backdoors. So who can access through a map drive through the file server. We have to acknowledge that we are going to allow some users to have access. So that's where that other layer comes in to control once they connect, what are they going to be able to do? Make sure that you have exit program rules to minimize the ability for those users to rename and delete files through those map drives. So if they can't delete a file, that attack isn't going to be effective. The nice thing is when you're working with exit programs, they can actually restrict all object users. So that is absolutely critical for that function, is that even though we are all object users, have all access pass on the system, when you have an exit program, it's interrupting that connection before the user gets there. So we could actually restrict that all object user. So technically, if you get down to the bones of it, all object can delete all the files in the IFS. But if we have the exit program that says they can't do it this way, you've minimized one of those vulnerabilities. And of course, you have to monitor those audit logs. So you've got your exit programs in place. You need to watch for suspicious activity and making sure that you're aware of who's actually attempting to get to the system, because somebody who's been denied access is just as important as the person who is accessing the system. So our exit point manager for IBMI gives you that perimeter access control. Think of it as like a firewall for the IBMI, where you can actually interrogate who's connecting and create some boundaries as to which doorway to that backside of the system they're able to get to. And it absolutely is going to give you that last and third layer of that hybrid approach to make sure that you've secured those connections to the system and you've minimized to the absolute end of your abilities for those ransomware attacks to actually attack the entire system. All right. One more polling question for you, Ian. What do we have? Oh, I know what this question is.
Yep. 1 second. I am all thumbs.
I've got 2 left feet, so we're a good pair.
Oh, there it is. All right, here is the second poll for you.
Perfect. All right, you guys. I'm curious if you want to do a free trial of our Powertech antivirus. So talked a lot about it, giving you that native OS scanning ability, but also the ability to block and minimize or mitigate any ransomware attacks that are coming into the system. It's pretty cool. It's a full version of the software, and you're going to be able to actually see it in action, and I'll help you set it up. So last critical piece there. All right. So happy to answer any questions if we have any out there.
Yeah, you can send in questions using the chat feature, the Q&A feature rather. Open it up and select to send to host and panelists, I believe is the option. So we have 6 or 7 minutes to do questions. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, there are people who are wondering about the replay of this webcast, as well as like a PDF of the presentation slides that Sandi went over. Both of those will be available from tomorrow on the Common Learning Management System, and you'll get an email from Common when those are ready to be grabbed. Sandi, this first question is, have you seen ransomware or viruses that are specific to AS400?
No, but it's not impossible. So that's an interesting question. And we all think, oh, because it's a different operating system, that it's not going to be that target. Ultimately, you could very easily create malware by definition for IBMI. It's any malicious software that's doing something that was not intended for the purpose of damage. So it could happen. There has been nothing explicitly for IBMI, but as I've gone through and demonstrated, the system can be unfortunately damaged by non-IBMI malware. We are seeing a big uptick in Linux and AIX. So, that is certainly shows that these alternative operating systems are a focus and can be vulnerable. And even though we have to recompile our programs on IBMI in order to make those changes, you get somebody who's motivated by enough money, it's not impossible.
All right, any questions, send them in using Q&A. We have a couple minutes here. This next question is, my IFS shares are all hidden, so I'm good, right?
Yeah, so kind of talked about that. So, hiding those shares is definitely a good practice, and it is just one of those pieces of remediation that we recommend. But assuming that you are having to keep the share because you are sharing it with somebody, then you need to be actually still aware of it. Hiding the share only keeps it from everybody. You've provided that share with somebody, and that one individual, even if it's one, can still be that vulnerable spot. So it is a good practice. I'm happy to hear when people are actually doing that, but it's not the ultimate solution. You have to take that next step and protect it anyways.
All right, last chance, Q&A panel. There's a couple questions. This one's, I'm new to IBMI, so where can I learn more about IBMI? Any reference resources available? If I can,
Yeah.
jump in there for a second. If you are a common member or are potentially a common member, we have a learning management system that has, I think right now, about 250, 300 hours of content on demand. We have boot camps for systems management, IBMI, iOS systems management. We have boot camps for RPG programming, boot camps for security, more relevant to this particular presentation. But anything else you want to say about that, Sandy?
Yeah, no, you guys have a lot of great information. And help systems also are, we really want to provide education as well. And we have a ton of educational webinars and resources as well. And really, the more that people know about IBMI and the more they're educated, the more stable our community is.
Yeah, and we work with help systems on a lot of our boot camps too. So
yeah,
our trusted partner, Midrange L
absolutely.
is another place to go, Midrange L, and there are a bunch of other resources too. I'm not quite sure that I understand this question, but it's simply, what about VIOS, V-I-O-S?
I think it might be related to one of the first questions.
Okay.
Not quite sure. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Sure.
Because I'm not
Chris,
quite sure.
if you want to amplify that question, I'll give you a couple seconds. Any other questions that folks have?
I like to think that I provided enough information that they don't have any questions.
There you
or
go.
it's
You've answered.
stunned silence.
You've anticipated all possible questions, and you've already given
There you
answers.
go. There you go. Oh,
Okay.
I love it.
Why don't we go ahead and end then? Thank you all for your time. Can we protect the VIOS with any software like this?
Oh, I'd have to dig into that. I am not sure how that comes into play. So shoot me. Yeah, Chris, we've got your contact information. We'll explore that further. I'd like to discuss that with them offline. So.
All right, let's take that offline then. Everybody, we're going to start. We're going to end about 60 seconds early. Thank you for your time. Everybody, look for that email when the replay and the PDF version of the slides are available. Sandy, thank you a lot for a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Ian.
All right, everybody have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.